Rodney Franks here at the KUVO studio. It's my real pleasure to have here with me. If not a legend in his own mind, a legend in everybody else's mind, Mr. Bob James. Bob James will be playing at the Newman Center as part of the Denver Jazz Festival, the second annual Denver Jazz Festival on April 9th. Such a pleasure to have you here with me today, Bob. I'm going to try not to fanboy out here in the next 15 minutes or so. So welcome.
Thank you. I heard in some of the promotion coming up for this event that I hadn't played there with my own group for 40 years. It's hard to believe that that could possibly be true, but somebody did some research about that. I know I've been in Denver. I performed there with Fourplay in recent years, but anyway, I'm glad to be back.
When you talk about Fourplay, one would get the impression of that was your group, but it was actually a meeting of four different minds. Is that true?
Well, yes, sometimes I get credit because I think I was the first one to bring up the idea, and I had been working at Warner Brothers at that time in the A&R department, and I suggested the idea of how much fun I was having in the studio. We were actually, at that time, we were working on one of my albums, recording a song called Restoration, and I had hired Lee Ritenour and Harvey Mason, but it was one of my first times recording in Los Angeles, so I asked both of them separately who I should hire as bass player, and both of them recommended Nathan East individually, so I knew he must be good, and that was my first time meeting him, and it was just kind of magical from the very beginning. It made the topic come up of forming a group, which we did.
And I think that's how some great groups start in that way, not any kind of grand plan, but usually it happens spontaneously, I guess, much like an improvisational musician does.
Yes, exactly. And that was exactly the way it was flowing. And you know it when it's happening, you can't predict it or you can't force it to happen. But when it does happen, it's really fun, still fun.
I went to school in Kansas City, Missouri, and I would go between there in St. Louis, where my parents were living at the time. My father was working in the restaurant business at the time there. And we would go through there, and there was Marshall, Missouri. Marshall, Missouri, situated pretty much in the center of the state. And I'm trying to figure out how a kid from Marshall, Missouri, of course, with musical support from your sister, but how how a guy from Marshall, Missouri turned out to be one of the architects of modern contemporary jazz. I envisioned you as somebody who would like sneak out of Marshall and either go east or west, either to Kansas City or St. Louis to get your musical chops together. But your beginnings are totally opposite from what I thought just by looking at your bio. Going and it seems that your basic education didn't come from New York or San Francisco or something like that. It came from the Midwest, going to school in Michigan and getting the fundamentals together in Michigan and Indiana, and it just seems like an interesting start for you.
Well, I'm still trying to figure it out 70 or 80 years later. I can't quite understand it other than this kind of thing. We started off our conversation with the idea of playing the music of freedom. And I felt that very, very young. I was lucky that I had a good piano teacher that taught me harmony and music theory. But my mother kept encouraging me to do what I was doing at home, which I was just messing around. I didn't even know it was called improvisation at that time, but I was making up little melodies and little rhythms at a very, very young age. And my teacher encouraged me to celebrate that when very often I think a teacher is so concerned about discipline and making you behave yourself or play what's written on the page or something like that. But I never felt as much enthusiasm for that, which is primarily the discipline of classical music. But I was drawn to this idea of not knowing what's coming next and creating right on the spot. And my mother encouraged me to keep doing it. And eventually I found out that there was this music called jazz that was the primary feature of it. And I got more and more intrigued, and then life took over.
And I was looking at the early part of your musical journey that you're very much interested in the avant-garde, and at least that's what that's the research that I got is that you had put together an avant-garde group and was interested in I suppose some of the avant-garde classical masters like Stockhausen and stuff. Were you interested in that kind of music?
I sure was. That was in college days when I really started to explore, and it was in the 1950s when some of that avant-garde music was being celebrated in universities. The avant-garde composer John Cage was kind
Yeah,
of popular at that time, and and it seemed somehow to tie in well with jazz improvisation, which is the unexpected, and you're taking the audience on a journey. And so I was at that time trying to put those two things together. And then jumping to the future, 50 or 60 years later, I met a young man who was 20 years old at that time, studying at the University of Michigan, and I was 80 years old at that time. And one thing led to another. We started talking about avant-garde music and talking about our interests in electronic music. And we ended up collaborating and doing an album called 2080. The indirect meaning being that what will music be like in the year 2080? And I had so much fun doing it. And now it's 6 years later, he's 26 years old. He's still even more interested in avant-garde music of today, of the 21st century. And we're still talking about collaborating again. And it was immediately stimulating to me to think that he would still believe that someone my age would still be interested in challenging our audiences in that kind of way. And I still am interested in it.
and I'm just curious as just a listener how that journey from avant-garde music came to collaboration with Quincy Jones and the more accessible musics. Did that early avant-garde environment inform what you were going to later on do?
Absolutely. The one thing that I remember about it definitely was that the composers of avant-garde classical music at that time were having a lot of difficulty finding performers that would be willing to play their music because it was so crazy, and they were asked to do things. The piano player would be asked to pick up some mallets and bang them on the inside of the piano on the strings and all this kind of stuff.
Prepared
And
piano?
the classical players would turn up their nose at that and not be willing. But when they realized that we were very accustomed to improvising or doing something on the spur of the moment, no matter what it was, so they found a receptive performers in us where they were having a difficult time doing it. And we learned a lot from them. We learned from how they were trying to incorporate those kinds of spontaneous or unpredictable things into their compositions.
By the way, my guest right now is pianist and composer Bob James, who will be appearing April 9th at the Newman Center. The Newman Center is a wonderful hall specifically for a musical performance. I'm pretty sure you're going to be impressed with the setup there, Bob. Um, with with that move from the avant-garde to the more accessible, for lack of a better word, musics, you brought that sensibility with you, and you worked with Quincy Jones for a little while as an arranger or working with Quincy. That beginning was something that kind of brought you into the national limelight a bit.
It was
Yes?
such a wonderful coincidence, and just something that happens in life when you least expect it. But I had gone to this collegiate jazz festival at Notre Dame University with my trio at the time, and we were definitely playing some combination of avant-garde music and straight-ahead jazz for our pleasure, for our stimulation, and we decided that we would try it out, not expecting anything to happen other than we might ruffle a few feathers by going to this more traditional kind of a festival. But no idea whatsoever about actually competing because we were playing music that was so different. But Quincy Jones just happened to be one of the judges at that festival, and it caught his ear at the right time, put a smile on his face, and we became friends, and he wanted to know more about why we were exploring this unknown territory. And I think it definitely stimulated his imagination too. But it was a friendship that lasted a lifetime after that.
And that somehow parlayed into an association with the producer Creed Taylor, and I could say the rest is history, but there was so much more history that followed your association with CTI Records. But you came on as more or less a session player playing piano, and you put you in touch with these really interesting at the time young musicians, up and coming, some of them established. That had to be an interesting milieu to explore music through.
Unbelievable opportunity. Creed Taylor was such a wonderful producer, and his studio where he recorded, Rudy Van Gelder's studio, was in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, across the George Washington Bridge, just outside of New York City. So we had access to all the best New York players, and I was meeting many of them for the first time through the association with Creed Taylor. So it was very, very educational, but also a life-forming change. And yes, that happened as a result of Quincy Jones also. That's when I met Creed Taylor. Quincy was working on his album Walking in Space, one of the first CTI records actually. And he hired me to write a couple of arrangements for that. And it was during that time that I met Creed Taylor for the first time. And just the fact that Quincy approved of me got me in the door, and that led to me being asked to play on some other sessions with Hubert Laws and various other people at that time.
It seemed to me like that particular label, the CTI label, was altogether different from some of the big juggernauts like Columbia and Warner Brothers and other labels. I would imagine maybe it's not the case that they offered the musicians a sort of a freedom to do what they wanted to do. I don't. Was there a mandatory list of Creed said, well, you must record these or you must record that, or was it the purview of the musician to record what he or she wanted to do?
With Creed Taylor, we had a lot of freedom. He definitely had his own taste, and he made his suggestions. And being the guy who was paying for the sessions, and it was his own label, he very often had the final say in what made the cut or who got hired again, or lots of things like that. But my memory of it, for the most part, was he was at least somewhat aware of my somewhat avant-garde background at that time, and he was willing to let me incorporate it in the midst of the more traditional music that,
like that music of Muskorsky. I mean, and it just that kind of blew my mind. It kind of gave me a sort of a window into classical music, listening to some of the things that you were doing. Which would
was a
especially
great
through.
opportunity. And he knew that I had the training. I had studied all classical orchestration in college, so I knew how to write for large ensembles. And he had the budget to be willing to let me come in with 8 woodwind players or something, or 4 French horns, which was a mind-boggling kid in a candy store type of feeling, to be able to do that stuff and then have it be beautifully engineered by Rudy Van Gelder and mastered, and the people would put those vinyl LPs on their turntable and they just sounded better than
Yes.
any of the music coming from other labels at that time.
One of the things that really blew my mind was your love of 17th century classical music. People like Henry Purcell. That beautiful piece called Love Song 1700, I think it was called, which was based
Mhm.
on a piece from Henry Purcell, and it just made me say, well, this fella Henry Purcell, he's a 17th century guy. He was around the 1600s. And then I started looking through some of the none such recordings, or some of the recordings that other players had done of his music. It just really blew my mind. So for me to be able to sit here and talk to you about these pieces, it's
Mm.
really a pleasure for me. I want to
It
jump
blows
ahead
my
here.
mind that you even remember it, so thank you very much for bringing that up.
Well,
It's such a long ago memory, and yes, that came about as a result of the freedom that Creed Taylor gave me to come in with an idea like that was not the kind of idea that one would have expected from Grover Washington at that time, who was somewhat known for his
It's organ
R&B
music. Yeah.
flavor and
Mhm.
a completely different style. And
Right.
it was that surprise element that put Grover into this fresh kind of a place. And it basically turns out that they're melodies. However you interpret them, Grover interpreted them so romantically and so beautifully that it wouldn't have mattered that much whether they were composed in 1700 or 2000.
Do you think so? So in other words, Grover's horn, his sound, his sonority worked well for to me. It worked well for the personal pieces and some other things that you have done in collaboration with him. And those first four albums, Bob, actually, man, through those first seven albums that you did for uh for CTI, the titles, it was just there was a theme. You got one. Says, well, then we'll wait for the next one. Oh, it's called two, and then three, and then four, and then heads, which was such a clever concept, but simple but deep at the same time. And as a kid growing into a young adult, it was just a real adventure going through it with you. Now that the adventure continues now, jumping ahead so many years up to now, you had been a couple of times over the course of our conversation, you mentioned the concept of freedom music. Let's delve into that a bit.
Well, it's so pertinent and relevant these days when so much trouble is going on in the world, and in many ways people are polarized and have such a good, difficult time understanding each other. And during those times, that's when I believe music can have a completely different kind of power because it speaks in sound and not in words. So what we convey is this notion that we can pick up an instrument and play with our fingers or blow into it like a trumpet or a saxophone and express a completely different kind of emotion. And I'm certainly the freedom of playing whatever I felt was a major reason why I gravitated into the jazz field rather than the classical world, where you're basically interpreting some other composer, somebody else's music, and that there's a correct way to do it and an incorrect way to do it. But in jazz, you're dealing with yourself. Everything that was always told to me when I was growing up, trying to find my way in this field, was the encouragement to be yourself, to play your own music. Don't imitate other people. In fact, recently some quote that I heard from somewhere was "Be yourself because everybody else is already taken." So you can't successfully be anybody else because they've already done it.
Kind of have no choice.
Yeah, but you don't really have a choice but to be yourself anyway. And if you work on that really hard and be the best version of yourself, then you have a much greater chance of playing this music of freedom.
Bob, I'm sitting here talking to you, and I know this is an interview, but to me, it's more of a conversation with me. Just this doggone microphone is in the way, and I wish we had more time to talk. I could keep you here forever, man. But I want to thank you so much for taking time out of what is no doubt a busy day for you to share some time with us in anticipation of your appearance in here in Denver, Colorado on the 9th of April at the Newman Center. You'll be appearing with your quartet. And give us the lineup again, please, before we go.
Well, my bass player is going to be Michael Palazzolo, and I recently have a new drummer that I've been working with that's taken me in a slightly different direction because I got to know him from meeting him at his original hometown of Canton, Ohio. But in recent years, for more than 25 years, he's been on tour and in the studio with Elton John. He's Elton John's percussionist. And just that experience alone and his different approach to his instrument made me very intrigued. And we have had a wonderful time developing new kind of grooves. And I think the audience in Denver will enjoy hearing that fresh new feeling to my music. And then I mentioned earlier, probably the most significant thing for me during this difficult time that we're in is that I had an opportunity to develop a friendship with a young saxophonist named Andriy Shmut from the Ukraine. And I met him 9 years ago, played a concert with him in Kyiv, the capital city where he was living at that time. And our friendship has just grown and grown over the years. And he's becoming a fresh new version of himself with his new confidence of playing this music of freedom with me all over the world and coming to Denver for the first time. So I'm really looking forward to showcasing his talent there. Actually, as a matter of fact, we'll be arriving in Denver fresh from being on a cruise ship in South America, where Andre will be with me, and we end up our cruise in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and we'll be flying to Denver directly from there to play our concert. So it's I know we'll be energized by meeting the South American people and sharing music with them, and I hope we can bring some of that spirit to Denver with us.
No question about it, Bob. We will be energized by your presence. Again, Bob James, thank you for coming on here with me and talking with me for a few minutes. And we all look forward to you appearing at the Newman Center on April 9th. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you, Rodney, and I hope to meet you in person when we're out there. Thank you for the interview.
You will, my friend.
Again, I apologize for my lateness today.
Yeah, and if I fanboy out on you backstage or whatever, just take it out. This guy's been listening to me for years. But listen, thank you again, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Rodney.
Okay.